Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the Glendale Transportation and Parking Commission special meeting of Monday, May 20th. So let's go ahead and start with the agenda. Just to let you know that if you have the agenda in front of you, there's two items that we're going to switch. We're going to take the action item before the informational item. With that, item number one, please.
Item number one is roll call. Commissioner Gonzalez. Commissioner Yakubian.
Yes.
Chair Pro Tem Sahakian.
Yes.
Commissioner Nazarian.
Yes.
Commissioner Kirkchin.
And also, just to let you know that Chairperson Kirkchin is not available tonight, so I'm sitting in his spot. I'm acting as the chairman tonight. Item number two, please.
Actually, item 1B is the flag salute by
Please stand.
Chairperson. Yes.
Repeat with me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Next item, please.
Item 2 is posting the agenda. The agenda for the Monday, May 20th, 2019 special meeting of the Glendale Transportation and Parking Commission was posted by Thursday, May 16, 2019, before 5 p.m. on the bulletin board outside of City Hall.
Thank you. Item number 3 is oral communications, but the only cards I have, they're for the parking item, for the action item. So if I don't have any other cards, I'm gonna open it and close it, and I'm gonna move on to the next item, please.
Item number 4 is action item. Receive presentation and report regarding downtown Glendale and Montrose comprehensive parking analysis.
Is staff ready for the presentation?
Sure. Good evening, Vice Chair Sahakian and Commissioners. Before you have the staff report. This is pertaining to the downtown Glendale Montrose parking analysis report. And this is part of the city effort since 2007. Probably Commissioner Sahakian was there back then when they did the mobility study back then. And with the ongoing, development and the city as it's growing from population, as businesses, as more activities, more larger projects come up to the downtown, the city requested from the staff to revisit those recommendations, take a look at it, see what can be done to improve the parking and street parking and parking structure management, and do some studies, see what we have implemented, how we can modify it or improve it. So the staff back then, they implement various recommendation at that time, including multi-space base station, charging parking along brand, adjusting the hours for the parking meters on off-street, wayfinding signs, as well as park once, and reduce some code requirement to improve and encourage the activities in the downtown for all the businesses as well as for the public. With that effort that was done, at that time, the study was only for the downtown, but the staff went ahead and implemented for Montrose area also. And with the today, where we are today is the council did the award contract to Transpo Group to revisit those. It's all really data-driven. It's a snapshot. They went back in November, December, take a look, do like inventory of all the street and parking structure in downtown as well as Montrose, the inventory, the use, the duration, what type of businesses in the areas, as well as see the turnover rates, and whether where we are today meet the standard, the threshold that this particular industry drives through. So by looking at this, the staff also we're looking at what can be long-term, short-term implementation of those recommendations that we see before you. There are two copies here, two reports, one for downtown and one for Montrose. It's available for the public, also extra copy in the back. What the staff is looking for tonight is really comments from the public, as well if you have any concern, any comments, and we're kindly requesting that the commission approve the attached motion regarding recommendation outlined in the comprehensive parking analysis to the City Council. And having said that, I will pass on to Ted Dombrowski. As you know, he's our parking manager for the city, and for more details and be able to go through those to report in more explanation, more details on that.
Yeah, just one question before that. Have we had any town hall meetings, or this is the first chance for the public to comment?
This is the first for this commission to see that, but the staff did have some comments, and if I may, when I mentioned Downtown Glendale Merchant Association, as well as Montreux Shopping Parking Association, were invited tonight, and the staff did meet with them during their own meetings at their own.
During the study, they met with the businesses?
After that analysis was completed, because we don't have anything at that time to share with them or explain what we're doing, it was shared with them, and when it was really allowed to release those documents was presented to them last week. But those meetings, Ted will be able to give you more details on that.
All right. It's yours.
Good evening, Chairperson Sahakian and Commissioners. In 2018, the City Council awarded the contract to Transpo Group to provide parking consulting services for a variety of parking-related items as needed. Transpo has been doing this kind of work for municipalities since 1975, and their current projects include the City of Pasadena, West Hollywood, Temple City, Laguna Beach, Newport Beach, Seattle, and Bellingham, Washington. Their first priority for us was a comprehensive parking analysis for both downtown Glendale and Montrose, which, as Mr. Hiddy pointed out, needed to be updated. Since September 2018, Transpo has been working diligently on this effort and is here tonight to present their findings and recommendations to the TPC and the public. This is the first time, and when the commissioners got the packets last week, that was the first time that everyone else had seen the packets too, and they were released. So at this time, I'll turn the presentation over to Dan McKinney, who's a principal at Transpo Group.
Just testing this. Okay, it's on. Good deal. Good evening. My name is Dan McKinney. I'm with the Transpo Group, as he Tad mentioned. I'm one of the principals and owners of the firm. I've been there for over 20 years, doing this type of work for about 25 years.
Well, you look 25 years old.
I'm 40, happen to be 45, and I'm aging quickly with 3 kids and so forth. But enjoying it. So I'm going to present to you some of our high-level results and a summary of the downtown analysis as well as Montrose. We've got 2 different slide presentations intentionally done because as we present this, sometimes it's just going to be Montrose-specific audience involved and downtown audience involved. We have 2 separate studies dealing with 2 separate issues and needs for each of those different areas. But there are many components and many slides that are going to be duplicated in terms of overall high-level strategies that the citywide aspect goes on. So bear with me as we flip through some of these presentations and go through that. So I wanted to start off by impressing upon you how valuable parking is as an asset. We get hired a lot of times in a number of municipalities and jurisdictions to identify how should we best manage and operate our parking assets. Communities used to not really manage parking and just build it and have people use it as they need, but it's really expensive to build. It's a very important aspect of the community, just like any other roadway infrastructure that you have, bridges, utilities, and lights. Parking is another one of those assets that's really important to utilize. In downtown, we really want to have parking support and that 18-hour lifestyle, that activity, that live, work, play, shop in those communities. It's the first and last impression that you have when you're coming into your city and your community. So we want to make it a positive experience, making sure that people can find available parking, that it supports economic vitality and reduces congestion. And the reason that it can reduce congestion is oftentimes if people can't find parking, they're circulating the roadway system and causing more congestion than is necessary. And as we mentioned before, it's expensive to build and operate, and so therefore it's important to manage it the best way you can so that you're not wasting some of your assets and utilization of that. So in terms of our scope of work, we worked with the city, identified the area that we would be analyzing and some of the different focus points, and we collected inventory, how much parking was available, where is it at. We collected data with regards to occupancy and duration of stay, and then we reviewed that information and data and then started to come up with some management strategies that we're going to start presenting to you today for discussion. And at a high level in the downtown area, we evaluated, I'm going to round, approximately 3,400 spaces. Of those spaces, you can be seen on the map, the blue lines represent the areas where on-street parking is available, and the green boxes represent areas where off-street parking is available. So off-street parking would be a surface lot or a garage. Most of the parking obviously is in garages and surface lots. That represents about 80% of your asset inventory, and about 20% is the on-street inventory.
If you don't mind, I'm going to interrupt if I have a question. So out of the 677, are those all paid parking?
So that represents about 20% of the inventory. About 15% of that is paid parking, and
Metered
there's
parking.
another, and there's 5% that is currently free or unpaid, and those areas are particularly on Luis and I'm forgetting the name of the street.
Maryland.
Meredith, thank you. So just on the sort of the east side of the study area here.
Thank you.
So from a big picture overall perspective, we wanted to look at the inventory as a whole and identify where does it fall in terms of occupancy per hour for both a typical weekday and a typical Saturday condition. The blue line represents your typical weekday condition, and the orange line represents your typical Saturday condition. As you can see, the peaking effects, as you would probably anticipate, during the weekday it peaks in the middle of the day, representing business activity, people coming into downtown for lunch, etc. On the weekend, it tends to be in the evenings when nightlife is occurring, people are going out for entertainment, theaters, and so forth. We have a line represented on there, a dashed line that represents the 85th percent occupancy level. So in industry standard, 85th percentile is typically the point at which parking is perceived to be full, and it becomes more and more difficult to find available spaces. And so we identify that as kind of a threshold a lot of times in the industry to say, when do we need to evaluate things a little bit further? When do we need to make management strategies and so forth? From this perspective, it is showing that there's actually enough parking overall in downtown to support the needs of the community on what's going on now. But obviously, this is a snapshot of the entire system. And so when you start drilling down into certain areas, there's definitely areas that are more congested and busier than others. And so I just highlight that, and we'll talk about a little bit of that as we go further into this.
And this is combined Montrose and downtown?
Nope. This is strictly downtown. And I'll flip presentations and dive down into the details of Montrose after this. So this is just this analysis area here that we're talking about. So with regards to on-street parking, we identified the Brand Boulevard was obviously your main corridor. It's where the primary destination is. It's where most of your activity centers are based off of. That was actually the busiest area, is probably by no surprise. So peak occupancies were around 95% on that corridor. It exceeded 85% occupancy for most of the day. So it's pretty busy all the time is basically what that says. The remaining on-street parking within that downtown area was less than 70% occupied. So there's a discrepancy between, the demand and occupancy of Brand versus a lot of the other on-street spaces. When we talk about Maryland and Luis, those are the unpaid areas that we were just discussing earlier about that we studied. Those occupancies were often peaking above 90% or around 90%, and that exceeded 85% for most of the day as well. Those are kind of on the what I'll call is the fringes of where land use starts transitioning between commercial and residential activities, and so that's probably why that it's free right now. And we'll talk about some management strategies maybe to think about that a little bit further. With regards to off-street parking, occupancy was greatest on the weekdays. So we found that this is primarily due to the off-street lots are utilized by businesses, employees, and people that are used to coming to downtown on a regular basis on the weekday. Surface lots were the busiest. They were over 85% occupied for 4 hours or more. And then the garage occupancies rarely hit 85% occupancy. So those were actually a lot of available parking within the garages compared to the other surface lots. And then what we tend to find is that people want to be closest to their destination, obviously, when they're parking, and they prefer to see where their parking is at. So in this instance, in downtown, you know, if you're going to downtown, Brand Boulevard is probably your ideal spot. If you can find a parking space on Brand Boulevard, that's great. Your secondary option is probably to look for a surface lot. And people tend to like surface lots better because they can see all the parking. It's a little bit easier and comfortable to park in. Garages tend to be a little bit your least favorite, if you will, only because you're not always sure whether you're going to get charged for the parking. You don't know how much is in there, and it's a little bit further away from your destination at times. So when we talk about the garages and off-street parking lots, we were asked to look at how does what the city charge compare to other private industry garages and lots in the area. And I'll have you focus on the middle quadrant where it talks about hourly rates, because that's something that maybe most of us can relate to, is what is an hourly parking rate for these different aspects. And so the average in downtown for private sector lots, or privately owned lots, I should say, but is publicly available, is $5 an hour, whereas the city charges $2 an hour. So in most of the conditions that you see up there, the city is well below what the private sector is charging and well below the market. That isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it is just letting you know that you are providing a better value in terms of parking. And the market is charging more so that there is flexibility to consider higher prices and so forth. So now I'll kind of dive into some of the parking strategies. There's a lot more details, obviously, in the parking analysis documentation that we have, and we can get into that as necessary. But we'll talk about the parking strategies at a high level that are identified to be kind of a phased approach. So we're going to mention a bunch of these things, and we didn't want to implement them all at once and all immediately, but we do it in an iterative way and work through the system that way.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yes.
Did you study Americana parking or mall at all, or that was out of scope?
We did not.
And that was intentionally out of scope?
So the first thing I kind of wanted to mention is that at a high level, what we really want to focus on and move toward is what we call as a performance-based parking approach. And so a performance-based parking approach is really making decisions based on analytical data and data-driven decisions. So that we take, some of it is really taking some of the emotion out of it and saying, and setting up metrics to say, okay, when this condition occurs, we, the city, are going to make these kind of decisions about it. This is really a trend that is happening not only in parking, but in a lot of transportation aspects. We can identify, we're transparent about what the plans are and so forth. And the idea is to really best optimize our parking assets and balance out some of those demands. Can we shift some of the demands off of Brand, for example, to other areas and make sure that we have available parking in a variety of areas within the city? When we do those demand balancing strategies, you're also, going towards meeting transportation and economic goals and livability goals about making our area a little bit more livable. When we're successful at that, and this results in convenient access to local businesses, businesses have available parking within close proximity. We're reducing congestion at peak times. People are not having to circulate as much around local streets and so forth. We're hopefully reducing driver frustration, because parking can be very frustrating at times, and provide for more of a positive experience, since it is the first and last impression when you are doing that. I want to mention quickly the target occupancies. So as part of that performance-based approach, target occupancies, I'd mentioned that 85% level earlier, about that's kind of a threshold of when parking feels to be more full and that something should be done about that. The city currently has that target policy, but there's not a lot of detail related to like, well, what do you do when it is 85%? Is it good? Is it good when it's exceeding that? Are we doing good, or is it bad? And so what we try to do is try to focus and put a little more breadth around that strategy and provide a target window. So our target window is 70 to 85% is what we're recommending. So when you're in that 70 to 85% range, and this is, you know, for example, when you're talking about an on-street area that's maybe parallel parking that provides 10 spaces along a long block, when you're within that window, it usually means that you have 1 to 2 spaces open per block face. And that's kind of an industry target of what you want to have, is that in different areas, you want to make sure that you have available surface parking, quick turnover parking for customers coming into shop at the local area. And then when we're below 70%, and it is basically underutilized. You've got parking assets that not enough people are utilizing. So you can decrease your management strategies. So lower your prices or reduce the amount of restrictions that are implied on that parking. When we exceed 85%, that's when it's feeling more congested. We would recommend more stringent management strategies like increasing prices or looking at different time limits and so forth. And so that's kind of the general window and the strategy behind some of the performance-based parking, is that as you collect data and as you understand your practices, you make adjustments and changes throughout time in phases. And one of the things that we have up there too is, when should you consider having paid parking? And so typically we like to, whenever parking exceeds 85% for more than 4 hours in a day, then that's kind of time to like, hey, it's pretty busy throughout the day and we should start charging for parking and starting to shift to demands and having people make different mode choices. And so with regards to pricing, I kind of mentioned earlier about the preference for where people like to park. First, on brand, visible on-street parking close to your destination. Secondly, in surface lots and in other on-street parking. And third, in garages. And so the demand management practice is to have a tiered pricing strategy, so that those most premium spaces that are most desired are your most expensive asset, and just like much of what we deal with in our world today. And so from that, we would like to see kind of a phased approach to looking at annual pricing adjustments. Typically, we would recommend around a 50-cent per hour adjustment per year, because that is kind of it's not necessarily, it's kind of industry standard, but it's also what most people are comfortable with from a political standpoint, as well as a comfort level. It's not, because it's kind of scary if you're changing prices from like $1 an hour to $5 an hour. That's when you get like a little bit of a fear and so forth. I apologize.
Sorry, it's okay, he's welcome.
So the first and foremost thing I think that we want to focus on is increasing our pricing along Brand Avenue and some of those surface lots where it's busiest and most desirable to park about. Once we start doing that, we would do it in an iterative process with 50 cents an hour adjustments and seeing how that demand shifts. And what we're trying to achieve is really it's not a revenue generating strategy, it's more of a demand management strategy of how can we shift demands away from brand to other areas and for different types of users. And at some point in time, we're going to open up available spaces, and that's the ideal condition that we want to have. And people make decisions based upon proximity and price and so forth. What we want to do too is we want to continue to utilize the 90 minutes free that the city is currently offering in the off-street public garages. The reason to do that is there's capacity there. And once with the capacity there, let's continue to offer that up as an incentive to come downtown and shop, and if people are willing to walk from those garages to their destination, it's a win-win. The theater validation program, currently there's a couple theaters that have validation programs, and I think the city wants to expand that to all the theaters that are there. And so that would be done in conjunction with those garages that have the available parking spaces. And then as we start making adjustments, you would start having tiered approaches or adjustments in each one of those tiers, just reflecting how the demand works. And that's really taking some of that emotion out and really looking at the data and analytics and say, okay, where is parking shifting to? Where are the demands at? And then adjusting those prices accordingly. Obviously, with increases in prices come, parking revenues and so forth. And so the ideal situation is to have a self-sustaining parking program. And so when you're collecting revenue from, parking, people paying to park, that should be feeding in and funding and the sustaining your program, whether it's equipment, maintenance, operations, and so forth. I think you want to evaluate that revenue generation on an annual basis and see how that's working out and see how we can best fund future improvements to the system. And we'll talk about some other management strategies that would include investment of that stuff. Part of that would be to develop a 5 to 10-year parking capital improvement plan. So identify where do you want those improvements to occur throughout your parking assets and how should we fund those, and come up with a strategy to map those out ahead of time so that as revenue's coming in, you know where to allocate it and how to best spend that money. And if applicable, which happens oftentimes, is that you might have surplus funding. So if you're gathering more money than you necessarily need to spend on maintenance and operations, then you can utilize that information or utilize those funds to put back into things that are helping the parking system, whether that's pedestrian connections between parking and destinations, streetscape improvements, signage and wayfinding, and some of the other strategies that we're talking about next. Parking regulations. I want to talk about this real quick. This is a demand curve showing Brand Boulevard and the on-street parking occupancy. So as I mentioned before, Brand's one of your busiest areas. You can see that there's an 85% dashed line across there, and both on the weekday and a Saturday condition, we're exceeding that threshold for much of the day. But you can also see, what I want you to note is that the gray shaded area represents the time limit or between 6 and 10 p.m. when parking is charged for, and there's hourly restrictions. And one of the things that we've noticed is that at 6 a.m., you're really not that busy in terms of a system-wide. So we would kind of recommend, why charge then if people aren't doing that? Typically, you'll start charging at 8 a.m. in most cities. And so we're thinking of shifting that charging curve or the demand curve or the time period that you would charge for parking to match more with when the demand is occurring as part of that performance-based approach. So that would be shifting it 2 hours in each direction. So maybe charge from 8 a.m. to possibly even midnight.
Just be careful for the businesses that start 7 a.m. so that 6 a.m. is good, because when you get there before 7, there's parking. If you shift it to 8, then there's no parking by the time you arrive there when the business opens on Brand Boulevard.
Well, this is the actual demand that we're seeing on Brand Boulevard. So you definitely would see certain blocks have busier periods than others, and this is aggregating the entire corridor, so I don't want to misrepresent what this is showing, but from an aggregate on the entire corridor, about 8 a.m., about half of the spaces were open. So yes, they start filling up at 8 a.m. and people are coming for work and so forth, and then there's time restrictions, so it's typically not employees that are parking there because it's a 2-hour limit and so forth. But one of the things that we want to start thinking about is the city start to think about is like moving toward eliminating time limits for some of that stuff. As you shift and if you start charging for later in the evening, then you can allow people to park longer, possibly. Oftentimes when you're coming into downtown and enjoying the nightlife, maybe you're going to dinner and some other entertainment aspect in downtown that extends beyond 2 hours. So allow that to be charged, allow the time limits to be extended in those periods. One of the things that we want to focus more on is looking at the residential parking permit program. The things that we're wanting to see or considering is that given that Maryland and Luis are heavily utilized and it's difficult to find parking along those corridors, thinking about how we might start implementing charge parking on those corridors and how we would implement that. But as part of that, we'd want to look at updating the residential parking permitting process in that area so that residents within that area can also park there through the permitting program, and basically since it's on the fringe or the cusp of both of the commercial and residential uses, you got to blend it and figure out how to best allocate those to each.
Just to interrupt real quick, the other part of this on the residential program is we have different timeframes in many of the areas surrounding the downtown. So if we shift the 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. period for the meters, it would have an impact on the residential parking as well. So we need to make sure everything is consistent and look at the residential parking whenever any of the other parking policies are changed.
Perfect, yes, thank you, Ted. So the other thing that we want to look at doing as you're moving forward in your program, and of course, we're talking about a phased approach. One of the things that the city's already started doing is looking at upgrading their technology and making parking more convenient, more user-friendly for people to pay, and also easier to enforce. One of those things that you've probably seen in downtown is that there's been a shift away from the individual coin-operated meters to a pay station, as they call it. And a pay station allows for less infrastructure along a corridor, and that has new technology for managing your revenue coming in and out. You can look at the data on a daily basis to figure out how are parking trends occurring from those transactions. And you can also have them utilize a pay-by-plate approach, which is what we're recommending as well. So currently, oftentimes you're putting in a space number that's identified with where you parked at. And I think we're going to want to recommend to go to a pay-by-plate approach. The equipment and hardware that the city has already started implementing has that capability to do that. It's just a matter of when do you want to roll it out and how do we phase it in with other improvement aspects that we're looking at. So when we go to that approach, there's less maintenance of painting numbers and so forth on the pavement. There are other things that could occur with those pay stations is printing out a ticket and placing it in your windshield. You wouldn't have to do that with a pay-by-plate approach. It would also allow you to transition in easier into pay-by-phone. So pay-by-phone is also often used in many communities for quick and easy payment activity where you enter your license plate in, and typically when you have the app, your license plate's saved in there so you don't have to punch it in every time, but also your credit card or payment system is also saved into there. So you can just program it and hit the button quickly. And the other part is improving enforcement. So once you have these abilities, you can transition to license plate recognition equipment on enforcement vehicles that will scan license plates and identify it, put it into the system. They'll know if that car and vehicle is paid, and it allows the enforcement process to be quicker, simpler, easier, and more efficient. And also, if a customer is parking is able to pay more easily or it's more convenient, the compliance level typically goes up as well. So those are things that we'd implement in phases over time as you start upgrading your system. The branding and wayfinding, I think that a lot of that has been updated in the downtown area already, and it's done a great job of that. And I think this is only thing this is doing is highlighting that and saying keep doing good work and looking at doing digital guidance systems. We've been implementing some of these digital guidance systems in other cities, and they've been very successful, and they've actually increased the utilization of some of the underutilized garages. It provides less anxiety for someone coming downtown trying to find parking when if they're not a regular daily commuter to downtown, and really identifying, do you have these signs in the right areas for when people are coming into downtown and making decisions? And so continuing to look at that as things change within the city is a good context. And obviously it has a lot of benefits that I think you're aware of. I think looking ahead, some of the things that we want to think about is continuing to balance the supply and demand. What we saw is that there is ample parking within downtown. So how do we best utilize it so that when you're in a certain area, it doesn't feel over congested and that you don't know where to park? And so how do we best monitor and balance that aspect? Parking is changing as well, and we're continuing to see drastic changes and huge trends in parking demand dropping in many of the jurisdictions and cities we're working in. So we're tending to see vehicle ownerships are going down. The younger millennial generation is not owning as many vehicles as my generation did. They're making different decisions about that, whether it be from an environmental aspect and their environmental carbon footprint or cost. And it costs a lot to own a car, insure a car, fuel a car, park a car. And then kind of continue to monitor those trends is all we're saying. With that, people are also taking more modes of transportation. whether it be transit, micro mobility with regards to shared vehicles, scooters, bikes, all the aspects of now how to get around our communities is changing, and we're seeing that in our parking demands and our aspects of that. So thinking about that as we move forward is kind of important. With regards to publicly available parking in private developments, I think we want to continue to encourage partnerships between the public and the private sector in terms of how can private sector then make their private parking, if you will, open to the public when they're not utilizing it. So for a general example is when an office building comes in downtown and builds a parking structure underneath or whatnot, that parking is usually underutilized or not used at all on the evenings or weekends. So how can we make that publicly available so that we can share demands and share assets that way? And then allow for innovative approaches for private development in their parking proposals. So allow, if a developer has a new innovative strategy, for example, automated garages is one that has been coming up more and more recently. Let's let that kind of be tested in those private sectors. If they're willing to test new ways of parking vehicles in more efficient ways, then that would be a good avenue to have that occur in. This is just a summary slide real quick that has some of the overall strategies, and the last slide I have for downtown. Really it's just framing overall that performance-based parking approach where we're making decisions based on data and really trying to best balance our assets and utilization of that. On the left side, we got our parking regulations and restrictions. We talked about shifting those parking hours and the paid times and considering eliminating some of those time limits. On the pricing strategies, I think we want to do a phased approach where we're looking at iteratively adjusting prices on a tiered basis so that we can best balance the demands and shift some of those aspects. The 90 minutes free parking we talked about, theater validation, and so forth. And then there's another bunch of aspects there that if you have questions on the downtown piece, we can talk about that, and then I can shift to Montrose at any time, answer questions now or after Montrose.
We'll wait to do it after the Montrose.
Okay, sounds
So
great.
let's
Can
continue.
we shift to a different slide deck here? And again, as I explained earlier, some of these slides look very similar because they're set up the same way, but some of the details are a little bit different. Like the overall technology strategies are going to be the same citywide, so that's why there's going to be a lot of repeat slides in here, and I'm just going to zip through them quickly to save time and effort. So Montrose. So again, valuable asset. The difference in Montrose is that you're really not supporting the 18-hour lifestyle necessarily. You're supporting local businesses, your employees, and aspects related to Montrose. And so we want to focus on that. Still a valuable asset and still something that you want to manage and making sure that you're providing available parking for your customers and employees in that area. Again, scope of work is very similar. In terms of we collected data in the Montrose area. You can see the study area here. It represents about, I'm going to round, around 800 spaces. About 75% of those spaces were off-street in surface lots. There's no parking garages necessarily. It's mostly surface lots in Montrose. The on-street parking, again, represents about 25%. The central corridor is Honolulu. That is the busy corridor in the premier spot within Montrose. It's landscaped gorgeously and has a really nice streetscape, and it's really the premier spot for where people want to park. So when we look at the demand trends for Montrose, they're definitely different than downtown, where your weekday condition in downtown is peaking during the middle of the day, but in the Montrose is peaking in the evening on the weekday, representing people going to dinner and other evening activities that are occurring in Montrose. And on the weekend, it's peaking in the middle of the day. People shopping on their days off, going to lunch, and enjoying the community there. You can also see here we've got that 85% threshold level, and most of the time we're falling below that when we look at the system as a whole. So again, we know that there's definitely hot pockets or areas that are more busy than others in Montrose, but looking at it overall, this is kind of showing that there is enough parking to kind of satisfy the needs and demands that are occurring within that area. With regards to on-street parking, on the left side I kind of have some stuff listed regarding the paid aspect of that. and then on the right side, the unpaid portions of the on-street parking. The paid represents about 2/3 of that 222 spaces, and the unpaid is about 1/3 in this particular study area. So the paid, what was interesting to us is when we looked at the data, the peaking conditions of paid parking was actually occurring after you are not charging for parking. So parking charges end at 6 p.m. in Montrose, but the peaking effect is occurring at 7 and 8 p.m. So we were, going, oh, geez, that's interesting to see that, when parking is free, then it's escalating on the demands there. Overall peak occupancies are around 80%. Honolulu exceeded that 85% occupancy quite a bit of the time. Definitely on a Saturday, it was 10 hours on a Saturday and then 2 hours on the weekday. And that's as a corridor as a whole. There's definitely blocks and pockets that are exceeding that all the time, depending on which part of that area you were in. Interestingly, Honolulu represents, the parking along Honolulu represents about 10% of the entire study analysis area. In terms of the unpaid areas, the weekday peaked around 2 p.m. and a Saturday peaked around noon. You can see the percent occupancies reflected up there. One of the things that we noticed on the unpaid areas is Wickham Way is just off of Honolulu, and it exceeded 85% occupancy, 6 hours on a Saturday and 8 hours on a weekday for that corridor. And so that we were looking at that, and it's kind of an interesting pocket where there's currently parking isn't charged, and it has long-term 9-hour parking in some of those areas. And so we were thinking about management strategies to how to best balance that. This kind of illustrates where those busiest on-street parking conditions are occurring along Honolulu, and then Wickham Way is that area in the green that I was just talking about. In terms of off-street parking, all of the off-street parking is currently free. There's a number of surface lots identified in this map. We did identify how many times or how many hours within the day is the parking occupancy exceeding 85%. Again, talking about that 85% threshold level. And so if you look at the dark brown areas, those are the areas that was occurring for more than 4 hours. That would indicate that it's difficult to find parking in those areas. And so management strategies could be done to address that. So regarding parking strategies, again, some of these are repeated in terms of citywide strategies versus specific to Montrose. We want to do it at a phased approach. Again, citywide, we want to go to that performance-based parking approach where we're collecting data, making decisions based upon what is being shown. Same kind of target occupancies that you would look at using that 70 to 85% window as your sweet spot. If it's above that, let's make some decisions on changing it. Pricing strategies might be the same. One of the things, not the same, I'm sorry, the pricing strategy in terms of tiering it might be the same. And so one of the things that you would look at in terms of Montrose, your ideal parking area is often Honolulu, on-street space, where the activity is at, landscaping is at, wide sidewalks is at, it's where the hustle and bustle is, if you will. And then other on-street spaces further away might be your second tier, and then surface lots might be your third tier. So our recommendation or approach to do this is looking at it at a phased adjustments and looking at Montrose pricing. First, you'd want to increase pricing along Honolulu. Right now, I think it's $1 an hour. We would want to look at increasing that and doing it at a tiered approach until we started seeing adjustments and shifts in demand away from Honolulu to some of the underutilized areas. And then start thinking about, after that's done and we've made some pricing adjustments, where's that demand shifting? Collecting some data, understanding where it's going, and then making pricing adjustments as you go. We would want to recommend expanding that paid parking to that Wickham Way, which is that one little corridor that was extremely busy and heavily utilized. So that's on-street parking and looking at charging for parking there. And then eventually, you might want to consider charging for parking in some of the off-street locations as some of that demand shifts and some of the adjustments are occurring around that. And then again, parking revenue and funding. The ideal situation is to have it as self-sustaining program so that any kind of revenue that you're collecting goes back into the system and paying for the maintenance and operations. You can utilize that money for maintenance and CIP. And then obviously any excess funds can go into looking at improving some of the streetscapes or pedestrian and safety improvements in the area related to parking. As I mentioned earlier, this is a snapshot looking zoomed in at Honolulu, and on the demand curves shown here, the orange dotted line represents the Saturday condition, and the blue dotted line represents the weekday condition. Saturday is busier. What we're seeing too is the gray shaded area, if you can see that all right, is the time that parking restrictions are in place and when you're charging for parking. That's basically from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. But you can see in both the weekday and the Saturday condition, your peak occupancy conditions occur after that time frame. So we're recommending, again, just like we were recommending in other areas of the city, is shifting that when you charge for parking and your restrictions to match the demand, so that you can better do that. And so one of the things here is that charging at 9 a.m., maybe shifting that to 10 a.m. if it's not as busy in the morning. But then also try to capture some of it on the evening period when it is busier, so that you can better manage the parking assets during the different time frames. Same type of, this is citywide approach, updating technology as you go. The long-term and employee parking is one thing that I think we want to drill down into a little bit further. So we collected data with regards to duration of stay and occupancy on Honolulu, but we didn't get duration of stay in the surface lots. And I think one of the things that we want to understand is that we did understand and learn, is that the employee parking program that you have in place now has been in place for a number of years, and it's very outdated, and it hasn't been updated in a long time. And from my experience going out there, there's oftentimes employees parking in certain ideal lots because you're allowed to park in different lots for this. So I think there might need to revisit this and figure out how do we best balance and identify how many employees do we have in the area in terms of longer term parking. Where do we want that to occur? Do we want it to occur in the most ideal spots? Do we want it to spread it out throughout some of these different lots? How can we best manage that? Because it's a different approach to managing employees than it is to manage a customer that's coming in. You want to make it more convenient for your customers to have short-term parking, and then obviously your employees and so forth, you want to have convenient longer-term parking in designated areas. Branding and wayfinding. I think the branding and wayfinding, as we talked about in downtown, was updated, and it has not necessarily been updated in Montrose. So consideration should be given to how do you want to update and have the look and feel of parking in Montrose. It would be, typically you would want cities to have a kind of a similar themed parking identification and branding throughout the entire city. But in a place like Montrose, it's unique and it has some character. So you might want to have some flair, if you will, or some branding elements that are a little bit different than downtown. But maybe you have certain symbols and certain identification that is still consistent, so that when a customer comes or a resident comes within Montrose versus downtown, they can see where publicly available parking is located at. It helps, guide people to where that is and makes the experience a little bit better. Looking ahead in Montrose, same kind of thing. It was just figuring out how do you best balance the supply and demand, continue to monitor the trends, and obviously facilitate some of the public-private partnerships that we talked about before. And then the summary slide here for Montrose identifies some of the different things that we just talked about in terms of the restrictions and pricing strategies and so forth that we mentioned to those different areas. So that's what I had for you, and open it up for questions for you guys if you have.
Yes. Commissioners? Questions?
Comments too?
Comments, questions, yeah.
Okay. Let me start. Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. One of the things that jumps out to me is something that I think is, as to reiterate your point about the wayfinding, a very successful thing in terms of kind of rerouting the traffic pattern as people come. Let's say they're coming south on Brand, they get off the freeway, they want to start their adventure and their experience in Glendale. So for example, when I go to the Americana and I go into their little parking structure, what discourages me from not parking or going into parking level 1 to get that premier parking isn't the fact that they're telling me there's 700 spaces up on level 6. It's for them to tell me there's 2 spaces available on parking level 1. And that discourages me from even entering into that zone. So I guess my comment would be, if you're doing signage and you're showing Orange Street parking X amount, 400, 300, 200, if someone's about to enter into Brand, they want to see if they get their chance at Boardwalk and Park Place right in front of Porto's, right? They want to go for the golden spot. My suggestion would be, if there is any way to get any, and if it's not too expensive, for the city to look into the idea of saying there's 3 spots on Brand right now available. That could get you to turn off of Lexington, and then I would do it. If I'm about to head out and I say, wait a minute, what's this Orange Street? That looks a lot better to me than this. That might start encouraging people to go off. So that's one thing I would look into. Did you want to comment on that?
I was waiting for you to finish, and I'll
Sure.
want to make sure I understood it. It sounded like you were looking for space identification for when available parking is on street, correct?
Right.
Like on Brand. So there
Right.
is that technology available, and many cities have been testing and trying, and we've implemented and been evaluating different technologies for that. Most of the time that requires sensor detection systems. So there's different detection systems for that. It requires an individual detection device on each individual space. It is extremely expensive. And what we found is many jurisdictions have tried it and tested it and are currently doing it. The failure rate's pretty high. So there's a lot of aspects that affect the mechanism and how it works. There's everything from a magnetic detection to infrared detection to heat detection. There's all different. I mean, there's companies coming out with stuff all of the time.
Right.
Someday, the technology will be flawless and inexpensive, or maybe not flawless, but it will improve and become better and better and less expensive. And I think we'll be seeing that. The trends are to do that. Right now, not many jurisdictions are doing it. Some of the bigger cities are doing it, and then they're having failure rates. So they're doing pilot projects. San Francisco is a big one that's been implementing it. There's a lot of different communities that have been doing it. And it's up to the city about how much on that cutting edge versus bleeding edge do you want to be in terms of investing your dollars in individual space detection. My recommendation for your community is to not do it yet, but to keep an eye on it. And that's one of those future technology things to look at and evaluate. In garages, you can do it a little bit better. It's still pretty expensive to be able to do it in a garage to do individual space detection, but you have power and overhead lines and a consolidated system
Right,
to
I think
do
the
that.
Galleria has that going on,
Yeah,
right?
so you can do that much better, and so that's in a high level. That's my
Sure. Okay,
my recommendation
yeah.
and discussion about that. But yes, I think that would be awesome. It's just the technology and the cost ratio is not exactly there. I would make a clean recommendation to say
Okay.
go for it.
Another thought that I had with the, another way to draw people, kind of, your whole purpose is to get the people off that artery. Chances are, if you're taking the percentage of the people that are flowing to look for a parking space, most of them are not going to have it, and there's going to be, like you said initially,
Yep.
a recirculation of people adding to the congestion. Any idea, or has there ever been any discussion with the merchants on Brand to do such a project or a proposal, an agreement, where whoever can bring in a parking from the city parking ticketing, you get a 5% discount on something. So it's encouraging people to come and to participate and go to these merchants, but then it's also helping, draw people to these parking structures. So it's kind of like a coupon, so to speak.
Yeah.
It's just an idea. I would do it if I knew I'm going to be able to go in someplace, show them my tub, and get some sort of a break on my bill. It might increase business as well, but that's for staff to, if anyone's ever thought of that or.
Somewhat similar to a validation program, but in a different way. Yeah.
Right. Okay, and then, again, my last comment, I'll quickly just jump to the Montrose, that it's that whole idea of, it's an experience, Montrose. I have been one where, you go in, I need to go into the watch place and just get a battery for my watch. It takes 2 seconds. So of course, you get sucked into that initial, hole of, Honolulu that takes you into it. If there's any way to be able to draw people before they get onto, into that part, to take them out to Florencita, let's say, to get them into the back way. Let your Montrose experience start here, and have people start moving into a different direction. That might say, but once you go in, you kind of are in, and then I don't know how you solve it once you start people sucked into the Honolulu route. If we could get them before they enter and come in through the sideways. But that's, again, like your wayfinding and...
No, you're exactly it. And it's really, excuse me, identifying the location of the guidance or wayfinding systems at those decision points. And what you're saying is those decision points are before you enter Honolulu.
Yeah.
And so therefore, can we put some guidance or wayfinding systems that are easily branded and recognizable so that people go, okay, that's where the primary available parking is at. And so, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner? Yeah, of course.
So on downtown parking, I heard that Brand was over 85%. I'm looking at the graph. There was another corridor, I think you mentioned it was over 85.
The unpaid areas were
Unpaid
definitely, and
areas?
there's more detail by block face in the report that identify, like on page 12 and 13 of the actual document, identifies individual blocks as well as garages and surface lots and how many hours that each of those areas exceed that 85% threshold. So there's a number of what I'll call as block faces or segments that do meet that criteria.
But overall, downtown looks like we're below 85.
Yes, from an overall big picture, looking at all the parking, yes, there's available parking within the area.
Looks like we're in 70 to 85 sweet spot.
Yes,
Okay,
in the peak condition.
okay. On Montrose, page 13, what I couldn't understand, on Honolulu, we have those blocks of over 85% for 8 hours, 6 hours, 4 hours, 7 hours, 12 hours, 5 hours, all of them. But then when I go to page 15, or 16, I'm sorry, the weekday hardly ever goes over 85. So am I missing something? Are we over 85 or we're not on Honolulu weekdays?
On weekdays, so the maps on page 13 and 14 are looking at individual segments.
Okay,
And when you look at page 16, it's aggregating the entire corridor.
correct.
So on the weekday condition, you actually are seeing that there's space available, on different parts of the corridor at different times. And so when these hours aren't necessarily occurring at the same time. So, for example, in front of a coffee shop, that block might be busiest in the morning. And areas where it's not open in the morning, it's not going to be very busy. And that's not reflected on this data. And so it's just a matter of how you're cutting and slicing and evaluating the data. So on page 13, it's looking at that individual block face. And on 16, it's aggregating the entire corridor over time.
Which I thought was the case, and again, unless this graph is adding others than Honolulu, but when you have 6, 7, 12 hours in that 9 hours, the aggregate would be probably something higher, but maybe something to check. It still puzzles me that only 1 hour is over 85 when I have 12 hours, 7 hours, 8 hours on Honolulu over 85.
Yep.
So that's it.
So the concern is the accuracy of the graph.
I can't average this off of the 13. I just don't know how that averages off of the numbers that I see on 13,
Yeah.
unless there's something else going on.
No, but it's basically when those peaking conditions are occurring on each of those segments may not be occurring at the same time throughout the entire.
I understand that.
That's really the difference.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I have a question, then I'm going to save my comments after the public comments. On the license plate technology, if someone parks on Brand Boulevard for 2 hours, he's limited out, he can no longer park for the day on Brand Boulevard. Correct? Is that detected?
You can, so the license plate recognition software, how it works is it's also correlated to GPS as well. So typically, you're either using an officer on foot or on a bicycle has a handheld device and can scan license plates that way, and it GPS locates that vehicle. Same when you're driving a vehicle and driving by, and it's automatically scanning plates. So it's basically digitally chalking the vehicle as you would in old school ways of marking chalk on a tire of a vehicle. It's doing the same exact thing digitally, and it is identifying the location of it. You as a city can implement a policy to manage it how you want it. So you could say you can only park 2 hours in that same space, but if they move a block over, they can park another 2 hours. That might be acceptable to you. So it's basically what policies you have in place to manage it. Or you could say you can't park along Brand. Once you've parked 2 hours, you can't park there at all. And that's just
And that's my question. On the same block, it's not a secret. Employees park 2 hours, then they switch, they find another space. Would this technology help eliminate that?
It could. It could easily eliminate it, yes.
Okay. All right, and on one comment, I definitely don't recommend wayfinding on surface streets because all it does, it encourages circulation. It encourages people driving around to find that one parking space on Brand Boulevard, and usually it's a frenzy to occupy that space. I know it's not working well in San Francisco, so.
Just as a point of clarification, you had mentioned wayfinding, but I think what we in the industry identify it as is a detection system, so individual space detection systems.
Right.
So the wayfinding is the signage and stuff, but that goes along with the digital detection
Yes.
systems. Exactly.
All right, if there are no more questions, I'm going to go ahead and call for public comments at this time. This is going to be the order. Rick Lemo, and please excuse me if I'm mispronouncing, Andre Ordibegian, Ken, I can't read the last name, Rayson, Greg Asturian, and the last speaker will be Jeannie Bone unless there are additional cards. You don't have any additional cards? Okay, Rick.
I'd like the three members from the shopping park to be together, Andre, Jeannie, and Ken.
So you all of you want to come up at the same time?
No, it's just saying that I go first and then she wants to go second and then he wants to be.
I'm fine with that. So Rick Lemo, please.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Rick Leno, and I'm speaking tonight on behalf of the Greater Downtown Glendale Community Benefit District. We've spoken not only with some of our members, but also our board members, and I was able to take Tad's outreach and extend it a little bit easier than many folks because I'm also have been a traffic commissioner for the last 12 years in Thousand Oaks. As you can see, it's a very high-paying job that I'm sure you all enjoy very much. We appreciated and respected staff's outreach, thought it was great. I spent 2.5 days this weekend here and there where I could stay awake through it, reading the entire report. I've got to find a better way to spend my weekends. But the report was very good as far as a 30,000-foot view. We would certainly support the staff recommendation of advancing it to City Council. But I would also like to mention the fact that we have to look at parking a lot differently than just what's in the report, because we're going to hit a nexus here very soon. Some people in downtown LA are feeling almost the height of that nexus right now. Here in Glendale, we estimated at about 22 to 25% of our parking has been impacted by ride sharing. Now, there's many ways to look at that. You could raise your prices, which will help people stay maybe a little bit longer and know where the spots are. Ride sharing, though, is going up, whether we like it or not. It's going up by way of age. We're finding that even within our company, people under 35 years old, instead of buying cars, they're taking Uber to and from work, and it's less than a car leasing payment. So all I'm suggesting on behalf of the district is we don't forget to also take a look at what the impact is going to be on our parking. Quite frankly, this study is a great way to understand how you want to identify and price your parking right now. But from a traffic commission standpoint, what it also should be triggering is, as new developments come on, requiring less parking. We're in a city where we want people to be more mobile and use more public transportation, yet there is no city per capita who's required more parking per construction than the city of Los Angeles. It's kind of a dichotomy. So we want to applaud the creativity and the facilitating of better planning that staff has inspired here with this report, and ask you to please pass this along to City Council so we can move forward as fast as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so the next speaker is going to be Andre or Bagan, and I just want to remind you that it's going to be limited to 3 minutes per person. Sure. Are we clocking it?
Good evening, Chairpersons. My name is Andre Dubegian. I'm president of Montreux Shopping Park Association. My being here today is because of the report that we just have about Montrose mainly. Our job at the association is to elevate our merchants, to be able to help them out, sustain existence, make them continue on in this journey that we all are together. I have a business there for almost 30 years. And as you see, I had some notes and pictures for you over there. The biggest problem we have in Montrose is parking. And if you see, in 1992, there was a project that never took place. And they were going to build a two-story parking lot in parking lot number 7, which there was a burger shop there. They leveled it. They were supposed to build it. Just never happened. So having said that, I looked at the gentleman's report, and I did a report of myself. So if you see on those pictures, I took some pictures at 4:30 on a Wednesday on parking lot number 7 from the second story. The one that I'm standing in is a private parking. It's always full because all the businesses over there park in our parking lot. And the one adjacent to that parking lot would be parking lot number 7, which you see the pictures again. It's all full. There's no parking to be had. And then I did the same thing after the next day at 4:30 in the afternoon. Again, same scenario. So I don't understand the gentleman that took that survey and find out that, oh, if you increase the rate of the parkings, it's just going to help you, it's going to divert it. We're not City of Glendale. For the same reason, I came down to City of Glendale, I looked at your parking signs and everything else, and I noticed city charges from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. For me, I would not come down to downtown Glendale. It's just extremely frustrating to find parkings. If you find the finding ways are pretty good, if you can direct them to those things, and I understand why do you do that, because you want to divert people to go to your buildings that you have parkings available, free parkings. But there is no such structure existing in Montrose right now. The two big parking lots, number 3 and number 7, are always full. We've worked very closely with City of Glendale, with Tad, with Yazdan, with City Council members. We've talked several times. We've done several studies. Every one of the studies end up being, oh yeah, you guys need a parking structure. You need to do this and that. And then here again, we have another study saying that, oh, the result is that we can easily raise the rates and you're going to solve the problems. You're not going to solve the problems. I don't know if the gentleman, why didn't they come to association? Because we could have given them some pointers and where the trouble points were. Nobody contacted us. And none of the residents know about these things. As if you know, I don't know if you know or not, Glendale Community College bought Citibank building, and they're going to be bringing 200 plus students to that community along faculties. That's going to have a huge impact on our community. You're going to have the same problem that you have in Orange Grove, where they have their other facilities. People are parking in the streets, and there is nothing to be had. So these are all the problems which, again, they didn't mention. So we have stroller-on events that we want to bring people down to Montrose to make sure, go to the businesses, see the businesses, make sure that they can, feel the experiences. We really try. Every one of our board members are trying to promote the town. We're doing through our social media, through our website, through our newsletters, and we have our board meetings once every month, and the city officials are there. So we work very closely with City of Glendale. But then they are aware of all these problems. I just don't understand. If there's a study needs to be done, it needs to be done alongside with us so we can point to problems. So the problem with the Glendale College community, the 200 students that it's going to be coming right now, what's going to happen to that? And then if you increase parking prices at Montrose, people are going to stop coming over here. As it is right now, it's extremely tough for the brick and mortars to compete in this today's society with onlines. And one of the advantages we have, we create an experience in Montrose. We make it a beautiful place. We make it a place that people can come and sit down and relax and shop and dine and all of that stuff. Now, all we're asking is a little bit of help to be able to elevate our merchants and therefore elevate our neighborhood and our residents and people who come visit us. And if you just try to look at the increase of the revenue, because as the gentleman mentioned, it's an asset, what kind of an asset would that be? The asset should be that you got to make sure that your residents, that your merchants can sustain existence. They can stay in business. They can do more business. Therefore, it will generate more tax revenue for the city of Glendale. We have to work together on this stuff. And on the same note with City of Glendale, instead of raising up the hours from 6 to 10, you should look into directing them with signs towards those buildings that you have and they're not occupied, not to make them, okay, you can stay only here for 2 hours. If I know in 2 hours I'm going to be kicked out, I will never come back to Glendale. So those are all the things that I think you should be considering. I have a business there for 30 years. We have other board members that they've been there for 50, 60 years. The experience we have here is extremely valuable. And if you're going to do any kind of a study, please, please contact us. Tad came to us a few years back and recommended that we raise the parking meter. And I said, okay, let's go ahead and raise the parking meter. The only thing I don't understand, may I continue or we're done?
I'll give you another minute.
All right, then. The only problem, we did increase it, but the problem that we're encountering here now, I don't know where that money is being spent. So if you're generating money, it should not be towards maintaining those meters. It should be towards beautification. It needs to be towards encouraging people to come to town, to visit everybody. Same thing with Glendale. You can increase the people to come to Maryland. Nobody's there right now. So those are the issues that you need to look into, not the ones saying that, okay, increase the meters so we can pay for the machines that we put on those. It's not good. So I don't know. I'm just here to see if I can be any kind of an help. I'm available to you at all times. So if you need any kind of pointers, I don't think that report is accurate. We have no parkings. There is no parking to be had. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer it for you. Otherwise, we'll just go for them. If you have any questions for me, I'll be happy to answer.
Well, we're going to continue with the communications, and
Thank
if
you
we
very
have
much
questions, we'll call you back.
Thank you.
So the next person is going to be Ken Grayson?
No, Jeannie.
Or Jeannie? Jeannie?
Hi, I'm Jeannie Bone. I'm on the Montreux Shopping Park Board, and I have a restaurant in Honolulu, Casa Cordoba, and I'm right near Wickham Way, and then kitty cornered across from where the new college is going to go into. So I'm just kind of taking a look at this and wondering why maybe perhaps the merchants in the area were not necessarily involved in this study or asked in this study. I don't know if anyone was asked in the downtown Glendale to get some feedback from what we hear from our customers and what the experience actually is. And in the Montrose 2020 study, I think this infrastructure came up kind of to the top. And again, we're talking about infrastructure. So I'm asking, Honolulu, everything's going to change. People say, oh yes, it's so nice to have Montrose, it's so pretty, we never want it to change. But that's not reality. Everything changes. Downtown Glendale changes. Everything changes. Montrose is changing. So what's the viewpoint of having Montrose grow over the next, when one of you referred to, what's the 5 to 10 year look of what Montrose is going to look like, and how are we going to be able to prepare for that with what we have today and the fact that it will change and it will be more demand on us. If it stays stagnant and it's the same, we won't survive. And so I have to think we have to look ahead to the future, and that's one of the things I'd like to, I know you addressed that in the study, but it doesn't necessarily look at the growth potential of what it could be and what it will be. regardless of, the parking is obviously a very serious issue. And I think if you were to ask the merchants on the Honolulu, what's their issue, that would be a fairly big issue. And so if Wickham Way at this point, you're taking a look at 85%, at that point, and that college is coming in, what's going to happen, and how are we going to plan for that? I think that's going to be a fairly serious issue for those merchants, especially along that corridor. So my thought is to involve the people who actually are investing their whole life savings into those areas, these merchants, and how are we going to plan the future with them? Okay.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So I guess, Mr. Grayson, you're up.
I'm Ken Grayson. I'm treasurer for the Montrose Shopping Park Association. My business has been in Montrose since 1953. Being treasurer, I'm very familiar with numbers, or numbers attract me. I want to give you some statistics here. Your latest city budget shows tax revenues of $140,823,641. That's from sales, property tax, and utility tax. Glendale has a population of 205,536 people. Montrose La Crescenta has a population of 19,653 people, which is 9.56% of Glendale. I'm going to assume that Montrose contributes 5% to your tax resources. I would like to know from you people, what have we gotten for our $7,041,182.50, because I haven't seen it. The last improvement that the city of Glendale gave us was trash cans to replace our hand-me-downs from the city of Glendale. That we got from a grant. The 2020 report that was done in 2016 that interviewed customers, owners, and employees, the two biggest needs were infrastructure and parking. I went to that night's report to the city council, and they were going to file it after they spent all those dollars and got that information. I got up and talked to the council. They instructed Mr. Ochoa, who was city manager at the time, to act upon the recommendations from that report. Nothing have we seen. According to public records, we have a right to know what is going on with the money that the city gets from us. I request a profit and loss report to show what our taxes have brought to Montrose. How has it been spent? Parking has been a concern for 35 years. This is a nice plan, but it's baloney. That includes, that money will never come back to Montrose because it never does.
Those are, if I may, those are good questions to ask to council.
I've talked to all the city council members about the problem in Montrose.
I understand.
They have done nothing, nor have they put any pressure for our business district with the Glendale College coming to Montrose. I even involved Senator Portantino. And all I got in a response from Mr. Portantino is that he talked to the board of Glendale College and asked him to, and they said he wants them to be good neighbors. They should never have been even able to come into a business district. Now, this report showed the Wickham Way parking lot as not being that full on a regular basis. That is incorrect, because my business is a half a block away from that area, and I see that parking lot every frickin' day. The parking lot behind the 2400 block on the north side has got about 10 stalls, and they're gone by 8:30. Parking is a necessary thing. We are fighting a battle of survival in today's world of business. And the number two things that are important to the consumer is convenience and time. You make people drive all over. Our area is only 3 blocks and a half a block north and south on Honolulu, on Ocean View. So we got 4 blocks of business, and we support, through the shopping park, 200 merchants. May I have a little bit more time?
I'll give you another minute also, if we can.
So, you know, this is really important. But I want to see what we have been contributing to the city of Glendale, and what have we got? You can prorate your police, you can prorate all the other things, but show me $7 million being spent.
And this is their own commission to ask that question to. That's what I'm trying to tell you.
But you know, parking is the life and breath of Montrose.
I cannot dispute that. I absolutely
And,
agree with you.
Trying to get people, raising funds for people to get parking things will not make it more convenient for them to shop in our town, nor will it do for Glendale. But I'm concerned about Montrose, because I've given 35 years of my life to try to keep this town afloat.
Thank you. Thank you. So I have one last speaker, Greg Astorian.
Chairman Sakian and Commissioners, my name is Greg Astorian. I'm not speaking on behalf of any commission, any board, and or organization. I've been a practicing commercial realtor in downtown Glendale for the past 30 years. I've written up a lot of leases, and I've spoken to a lot of merchants. I absolutely agree with what was said here, that you need to reach out for any kind of report to be meaningful. And this is a good report, there's no questions about it, but it needs to be propounded or expanded upon. And the only way you do that is to get the facts from the folks that are on the ground. And those are your merchants. They will tell you the good, the bad, and the ugly. I've spoken to 4 merchants on Brand Boulevard today. None of them have been contacted. The BID may have, but those are the people that you need to reach to find out what is going on day-to-day, hour-by-hour basis. I didn't see that in the report. We didn't get any feedback. I think you need that to make this report better. This report needed to be dependent on some sort of a growth projection for future, the 5 and 10 years. I believe Jeannie spoke about that. And that's very important, because you don't know, and I don't know, well, I do to some extent, because that's my business, what's going to happen in 5 years. Demand absorption or absorption studies can very easily be done, and it need not be very expensive. That needs to be coupled with this report, and then the findings would be meaningful. I'll give you an example. The theaters on Maryland, 500 or 600 seats. They're vacant right now, but it will be opening up pretty soon. What will be the effect of that on the Exchange parking lot? Has that been considered or taken into account for the report? That's just one example. Or what Commissioner Yagubian talked about. Have you talked to merchants to see if you can couple a validation with a discount? That's a terrific idea. It needs to be explored. But the only way you can do that is to talk to the merchants. Most importantly, have you reached out to the office building owners? These are all institutional owners. Most of the time, at least on weekends, office uses can be, there are no folks that are going to be working in the office, and that's vacant space sitting out there that can generate revenue for the building owner, and it could help with the parking issue that we have. Let's face it, at 85%, considering 85% capacity, in 5-10 years, I don't need to be a genius or rocket scientist. I can tell you, we're going to be at 100, 110%. Now, if you're not going to be able to, and I think, Mr. Chair, a while back, there were discussions like this happening in downtown for the city reaching out to the office building owners and so forth, but I don't know what the outcome was. I think it'll behoove us to do that. If we can't, if none of these office people and or owners want to partner up with the city of Glendale as far as providing parking and making revenue at it, then you have no other choice with or without ride sharing, the 25% that was just mentioned. That you have no other choice but looking at opportunity sites. A couple of them come in mind, the parking lot behind Porto's and the one that the museum is going to be built on it. The museum is going to make a hole in there anyways and build about 200 parking spaces. Why aren't we considering partnering up with them and provide additional parking that is so badly needed in downtown Glendale? Again, looking at the projection between 5 and 10 years from now. No parking study can be complete, Mr. Chair, without considering valet parking or one-stop valet parking. It's a convenient feature. Pasadena has taken advantage of it, that you drop your car here and you go up and down Colorado and you can pick your car up wherever it is. I mean, there have been talks about that in the past in the city of Glendale. Nothing has been done on it. Why aren't we looking into that too? Just one more comment,
Yes,
and I will be done. That reminds me of when my doctor sounds the alarm. Let's talk about Lot 7, I believe, in Montrose. Studies were done. I know, long time ago, studies were done. And you can, if we have to double the capacity, it's going to be costly. There is no questions about it. But if you want to preserve an area and make it better, again, considering the projections in the 5 and 10 years' time, the community should put up with the construction, and the city should foot the bill to build a parking structure that is going to help a lot of people, not only just the merchants, but the folks that are living around it. With that, I will conclude my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Commissioners, any questions or any comments from the speakers?
I'm good.
You're good. Mr. Yakubian?
Yeah.
You're good?
Good. That's good.
So we do have a motion, and we do have alternatives in front of us. Alternative number 1 is to approve staff's recommendation. Alternative number 2 is to recommend some of the recommendations. Alternative 3 is note and file, and the last one is to make new recommendations. One of my first questions when the meeting began was, did we have any town hall meetings? The reason I asked that, I would have expected the full chambers here. I honestly would have, because it's a very sensitive topic. Please, you spoke. So that was a concern of mine. The private-public partnership in a topic like this is extremely important. I highly respect the report, no ifs and buts about it. Some good recommendations that I can support, some recommendations that I might not agree with. For example, extending the hours of parking, it's only going to encourage more employee parking on the street. So there's pluses and there are minuses. But my biggest concern is that, did we reach out to the private sector, who's the life of these central business districts, to get their feedback. And one indication to me is that we have only 3-4 people here asking questions. That tells me that we didn't do our homework, I'll be honest with you. So with that, if I don't have any other recommendations or motions, I'm going to note and file. I'm going to recommend to note and file and further look into this to reach out to our communities, to our Chamber of Commerce, to the business district, and get their feedback. We might end up with the same recommendations, but at least we heard them. And even if I'm ready right now to make a motion and move forward with the Glendale downtown area, and I absolutely agree with some of the comments made, I'm definitely not ready to make a recommendation on Montrose, because Montrose is a different, it's a different demographics, it's a different setup, they don't have any structures, there is 4 blocks, 1 block up, 1 block down, and the community's input, the business community's input is extremely important. That is my recommendation, unless there's another motion or recommendation on the table. All right, so recommendation is note and file. You second that?
I second it.
Okay, so let's vote on it.
Commissioner Gonzalez, Commissioner Yakubian,
Yes.
Chair Pro Tem Sahakian,
Yes.
Commissioner Nazarian,
Yes.
and Chairperson Kirkjian.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Good job on that. And if you need us to assist you in any way at those merchant meetings, in the past, especially Commissioner Yakubian has been very helpful on that topic. And if I have the time, I'll be more than happy to do it. And also Commissioner Ulysses. Thank you. All right. Thank you for coming tonight. Let's go ahead and move to the next item.
Item number 5 is information only, the Glendale Burbank Regional Streetcar Feasibility Study.
Good evening, Chair Sahakian and Commission members. It's my pleasure to be here before you for the first time. My name is Bradley Calvert. I'm the Assistant Director of Community Development here at the City of Glendale. And part of that scope is mobility. Some of that work that we do includes the pedestrian plan, the bicycle plan, and what we're here to talk about this evening, which is the streetcar feasibility study that we are currently engaged in. We recently gave an update to Council, but we also wanted to come to the Transportation and Parking Commission to essentially inform the Commission where we are in this feasibility study process, what those next steps are, and things to look out for. So really the overview of this presentation is to look at the scope of work of this project, the route alternatives that we're considering, that is essentially the meat of this presentation, what some of those impacts could be to the streets along these routes, and then what our next steps are. So the objective of the Streetcar Project is to create a modern, highly visible, and efficient streetcar route that will serve as a high-capacity transit corridor linking the Glendale Transportation Center with downtown Glendale, its adjacent neighborhoods, the business districts, and potentially a future connection to Burbank. This is essentially the mission statement behind this feasibility study and what is kind of guiding our principles and as we move forward with it. The scope of study essentially has 2 phases. The first one is looking at the Larry Zarian Transportation Center to Glen Oaks Boulevard. We wanted to determine the need for the streetcar as part of this, create and test route concepts, which is essentially where we are right now, analyze ridership potential and accessibility, that includes cost and the impacts to streets along with that, and to coordinate this with other projects. There are a number of other initiatives going on. We have BRT, we have our own bicycle plan, our own pedestrian plan. There's a number of potential impacts or conflicts that could occur. And then ultimately to wrap this study up with an implementation plan. Not funded and not part of this, but under consideration is at phase 2, which is connecting that streetcar to Burbank, essentially via Glen Oaks. Streetcar basics, none of this is probably new, but just for background information, the tracks are embedded in the pavement. They do share the lanes with automobiles. They are electrically powered. That can be through batteries or it can be through overhead wires. And they are ADA compliant. This example here, the Atlanta streetcar, which I had an opportunity to work on a number of years back, exhibits the ADA accessibility with the low floor and the actual car itself. Some of those station elements, as mentioned in the prior image, that level boarding platform, they could include seating, they could include guardrails as well. As you see, it's higher than a standard curb, so for safety purposes, they come with those warning strips and potentially guardrails. Signage, trash receptacles, but they can also include fare boxes, arrival displays, public art, landscaping, and bicycle storage if we're looking at a connected multimodal network here. So this is the study area. You see a number of lines on this map. Essentially, we've distilled this down to 2 early route alternatives. That does not mean that's the end of our study, or in terms of analysis of alternatives. We will look at other options that fall under those. But we were looking from the transit center to about Glen Oaks. And ultimately, this is broken into essentially 2 segments. Right now, we estimate somewhere around Maple or Lomita Street is where this streetcar could transition over to Brand. So essentially, that southern portion going down to the transit center, we've identified 1 alternative and then 2 alternatives going north up to Glen Oaks. So that first segment, that southern portion of it, as mentioned before, we're kind of pegging Lomita as that crossover point to Brand. That doesn't mean that necessarily will be that street. It's just kind of under early consideration. But this would be bi-directional along Central Avenue. So north and southbound would be on Central. You'd see stations occur every 4 to 5 blocks on the right side. Those would be curb running tracks. The existing parallel parking would be able to remain in these cases. There would be minor impacts to some of that parking because of streetcar platforms that would need to align with the sidewalk, but we would expect minimal impact to parking here, and these streetcar tracks would actually be in the existing travel lanes. Sample street section there, as you can see, parking on the outer sides, curb sides, and then you have the 2 travel lanes for the streetcar, 2 more travel lanes for cars. Again, the streetcar lanes will also carry automobiles, and then a center turn lane. The second portion is where we get into 2 different alternatives that we're looking at. Essentially, if we're assuming we're crossing over at Lomita and connecting to Brand, in this case, it would actually look at a loop alternative, which would continue the train northbound, or the streetcar northbound along Central, turn at Glen Oaks approximately, and then come southbound along Brand. Again, stations every 4 or 5 blocks. This way you have the streetcar tracks on Central and on Brand rather than concentrating it all on one street. You would see minimal impact to parking on each street since you're kind of spreading this out over both, but we would have to convert some angled parking along Brand in order to accommodate the streetcar, and that would likely turn that into parallel parking. And I'll show a street section in just a moment as to why. So alternative 1, the advantages here is that we do minimize the disturbance to Brand because we've spread that out. All the construction of the rails do not occur just on Brand, they occur on Brand and Central. So we minimize that construction disturbance. We avoid some conflicts at 134 because we don't have all of the streetcar traffic in one side just on Brand. It's spread out again. And it supports the urban development on Central, essentially acting as a catalyst for further development. We have a lot of parcels, especially on the west side of Central, that are primed for redevelopment potentially in that transition zone. Some of the disadvantages is that it's less intuitive for riders, and I'll show that in just a moment. It is a least direct route because it is forming a loop, essentially, rather than just bi-directional north and south. There's potential interference with the BRT study that's going on with Metro right now, as they are looking at Central as one of those potential routes for the BRT. We also have bike lanes on Central that could come in conflict with. And there's also the potential of the diminished economic value because you've essentially spread your peanut butter too thin. You put it on both sides and you're not concentrated all of your pedestrians either in an area you would like to see improve from a commercial activity standpoint, or you've put it all on one instead. So when I said that was less intuitive for riders, what I would point to here is that essentially if I was a user and I was coming out of the Galleria onto Central and I wanted to go back to the transit center, what's going to be most obvious to me is going to be the station right there on Central. But the challenge with that is that it's actually going to go north first and then come back around south, when it actually would have made sense for me to walk another block to the station that would have been on Brand. Currently, the Atlanta streetcar does this. They did that by design because the roadway was just too narrow to carry both on the same street. And there is a diminished value to that, especially when you have visitors coming to town. In this location, the Americana and Galleria is a very good example. And essentially you could potentially drive people away from using that system again. And one of the comments that we've heard from the public thus far recently at an event on Artsock Avenue was that a lot of users really want to use this to connect to downtown Los Angeles. So we could expect a lot of riders coming from outside of Glendale to come to our commercial center, our retail center, and we really want to make sure that's intuitive for them. So Route 2, we're looking at crossing both of those tracks over somewhere around Lomita or Maple and running, excuse me, bi-directional on brand. So north and south, both on brand. Again, stations every 4 to 5 blocks. The travel lanes for the streetcar would be curbside. This would require transitioning pretty much all of the angled parking that's on brand. And I'll cover another portion of that in just a minute. That's not the only alternative we're looking at, but that may end up being the most preferable one. So street section here, you can see that parking. If you look on the right side, that's now converted to parallel parking to create that extra room for that travel lane for the streetcar. We can still maintain lanes, 2 lanes, north and south, 1 center turn lane as well. The advantages is this makes it a most easy and direct route, especially if I'm coming from out of town or if I'm visiting. I know which way is north, I know which way is south. That streetcar is not going to take me on a loop route. It really reinforces Brand's role as a multimodal corridor. It's a very different street, very different character than it is from Central. This really reinforces the fact that there are pedestrians, cyclists on this street, and giving them another option, another mode of transportation. It does create a direct connection to the commercial and entertainment activity center of downtown Glendale, of Glendale itself, and it really concentrates all of that where the most pedestrian activity is currently at. And that's where the greatest ridership potential will be, especially with all of the recent urban developments that have occurred along Central and other portions of downtown. Some of the disadvantages here, greater impacts to Brand, obviously, because you would be putting both sets of tracks on one street. The potential impacts to parking, we could estimate losing anywhere from 30 to 40% of the parking because you would be converting parallel to, angled to parallel. And then the impact to the 134 ramp, since it's going to be on that same street rather than spread out. Again, we're not looking at just running curbside. The old red cars used to run right through the median. The question will be with our stakeholders, with the public, with council, with the commission here, is what's more important? What's the value trade-off here? We know that the angled parking represents a certain downtown Main Street characteristic that many appreciate and many enjoy, but those medians also offer something as well that create a city beautification element to downtown, essentially. So that's one of the questions we'll be looking at moving forward, is where exactly would we like to put those tracks on Brand? So overall, we're looking at, one of the things we want to do as part of this, and something that will come in the next phase, is doing a block-by-block analysis on how this streetcar impacts not only parking, but other modes of transportation. Essentially a dig once philosophy. We have a pedestrian plan and we have a bike plan out there. This may be a great opportunity that while we're digging and establishing a streetcar, that we could implement elements of the bike plan or the pedestrian plan so that we can get simultaneous improvements from it. Just an example there from Seattle, where their streetcar runs through First Hill and some of the bike lanes that were put in around the same time. So some of the next steps, we are planning to come back to council likely sometime in July. We are looking at the ridership potential now. We'll try to nail down where some of those station locations could be. And we're also looking at what the economic benefit will be. As mentioned before, this is a great opportunity to catalyze Central itself, whether it's on Central or Brand, that close proximity could do that. We want to study the impacts to the parking. As mentioned before, there could be a loss, potentially 30 to 40% of on-street parking if that were to be converted to parallel. There is a maintenance facility that needs to go along with this as well. Likely that would land somewhere near the transit center already. There's not a lot of available parcels to locate that elsewhere. It's also not a compatible use. And speaking of compatible use, one thing I didn't mention earlier, and this may be a question, is we did not look at bringing this up Brand entirely because the land uses on the southern portion of Brand are not compatible with essentially a high capacity transit system. Most of those are auto retailers right now, so those current uses are just not compatible, and by taking that up Central and then crossing over, we actually can capitalize on the urban development that's occurring in the Tropico neighborhood. Some other things that we're looking at, the overall impacts to the BRT, the B line, any other transportation options along there. As mentioned before, there could be impacts to bike lanes. We are starting to kick off some of the outreach and the engagement. As mentioned before, we did this at the Activate ArtSoc event, where we asked the public their opinion, how they would use this, what they thought about the routes. We've been to the Chamber of Commerce. We're actually going to the Downtown Glendale Association this Wednesday, and we'll continue that outreach in the coming months. So that concludes the presentation. Otherwise, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions. And our consultant, Terry Nash from HNTB, is also here that can probably answer more technical-minded questions, if you will.
Questions?
Well, let me start off with, well, thank you. I want to know, there's obviously so many issues that are involved with this whole idea. How has the city been involved with this study up to this point? I mean, what parts of the city have actually contributed and have been a part of this feasibility study, just so I understand?
Do you mean neighborhoods that have participated, or
city, like actual city departments? Like, because we have a big source of wealth of our city, and studies that have been done, and grants that have been given for many things. We have a source of knowledge in our city staff. Have they been a part of this? Have they been, or is this? Are you just coming kind of separately out and?
No, we have Public Works is engaged, Economic Development is also a part of this, understanding the impacts to downtown, and then our planning division as well. And as this advances, we'll...
Community Development has also been, are they also involved since?
So Community Development is actually managing this right now.
Managing this thing, okay, very good. How do you propose, I mean, when this is coming forward, the idea of what's coming, we had a discussion of what possibilities there are with Glendale. We're doing the whole mobility study, but the idea of understanding what's happening in the future and what's coming to, how are you, when you're doing this feasibility study, it seems like there's so many unknowns that are still yet to be kind of shaken out and understood with the direction that Glendale's going in. Everything from bicycles to parking to ride sharing to et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How are you able to really give a good feasibility study when we still don't have so many components, including Metro, what they're planning on doing? How do you think that all shakes out in terms of presenting like a really solid study?
Some of those things are happening concurrently. So we are actually going to council tomorrow night with the pilot program for shared mobility, bikes and scooters. That'll be something that we'll factor into this study as well. We're already incorporating elements from the Metro BRT study as part of this to understand that overall impact. And what we're looking for in terms of the ridership potential here is the development potential of downtown, recognizing that it is becoming a more urban place. We've heard comments this evening, actually, about users finding other modes, other means to get around, and how that will ultimately play into the ridership potential of the streetcar, and how that can inform land use decisions going forward as well.
This is a huge project, right? It's
correct.
I mean, to me, like all of those need to be the vision has to be 2010 with Glendale to be able to then incorporate something like this. It just seems like such a big project to be uncertain about, any of these aspects. It needs to really be nailed down. So it's an interesting project to consider. I'm just, with the convergence of great changes that are happening now, not just in Glendale, but in society and technology and whatnot, I just want to make sure that whatever's getting done is done in a very efficient, economical, beneficial way, non-intrusive way for the merchants, for the residents, for visitors. So I guess that's just me thinking in my head. Understanding options and which route to be going on seems to me. Talking about, where we should be planting our base station on Mars. It's like, to me, so quite not there yet to even be thinking that until we figure out, how we're getting there and, how this is all going to be done. But
This is the start.
well, it's getting the
We're gonna
wheels
start
turning,
somewhere.
but I hope that, before anything, congeals, we really do, we had issues just with the previous thing, trying to get stakeholder comments and on such an important study. Here we have something else coming up. I'm hoping that that we make sure that we get all the input. Right, so that's my comment, but thank you very much for the presentation.
Quick one.
No, you good?
Actually,
Go ahead.
quick
Yeah,
question.
of course.
Bi-direction versus loop. My personal actually preference is loop, and this is the reason many cities I've been in. I've used streetcar. Last year, actually, Kansas City was the last example I used. The beauty of loop is you can hit in multiple places, so you don't going up and down the same street. And I know there are disadvantages you mentioned to it, but it's the fact that we're hitting both Brand and Central, to me, that's very appealing, something to consider. One thing I couldn't understand was the angled parking versus parallel parking. I think on parallel parking, still we're going to lose quite a bit just to create the stations, right? Is there analysis how many it is on Brand or Central, both?
We're not quite that far yet.
Okay.
Right now, that's more of an estimate. We know that converting from the angle to the parallel is naturally going to reduce that number, and then on top of that, we would have the stations that would go in place as well.
Okay, on top of that, you're still going to...
40% you said loss.
30 to 40 potentially. That's something we're entering in now, and hopefully that's what we'll have ready with council as well in July. So.
Okay.
And we plan to return to Transportation and Parking Commission as well. So.
My big question is, and thinking ahead, is there are other people movers. Have we considered an elevated system where we're not taking any real estate at the street level? Have you considered cable cars? And you see this in Europe. It seems that they're always ahead of us when it comes to technology and innovation. Have we considered any of those? Because killing 40–50% of the parking on Brand Boulevard, and it's so ironic that just before this, we had a parking topic. I don't know if that was done on purpose or not, but I was studying a tram system from the Gateway Plaza to the Dodger Stadium. I was the only one who made that recommendation. An elevated tram system. Now, it doesn't have to be a tram system. There are systems that are less cost prohibitive right now, much cheaper. I can show you many of them. I'm sure HNTB is very familiar with them. There's one at Heathrow Airport, and you can build them so quickly. You can build them in the middle of Brand, in the middle of Central, 4-foot footprint in the middle of the street with stations every 4 blocks. You would not only accomplish the same thing, you will not intrude on any existing, because I'm going to ask for mitigations. If there are disadvantages for the plans, this commission is going to be asking, what are we doing to mitigate that, right? So why can't we be innovative and think of, 20 years from now, what other city is going to look like, and let's try to be that city right now if we're investing the money. Just a thought. I know this is information only, but just a thought, and I'll be more than happy to even email you some technologies out there globally that are being used at this time. The quick to build, there's a system that you can build a mile per month. It's as simple as that. So a streetcar is fine, but my concern again is eliminating parking. It's the freeway system, the 134 off on at Brand Boulevard, impacting that. I don't know how you can mitigate it, honestly. With that, I'm going to thank you again for the presentation, great presentation. And next item, which is Commission staff comments and updates.
Item number 6 is Commission staff comments and updates.
Do you have anything else? Okay, I'm good too. All right. Item number 7.
Item number 7 is adjournment.
Do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Second.
Adjourn.